The Sleepy Hollow fire started in Chelan County Fire District 6's area. Initially, there was probably about, I'd guess, 12 primary residents that were threatened. We had damage to 2 different engines. It was some very heroic actions over there. And Mother Nature gave us a battle that we could hold our own. And it was an active fire battle in Sleepy Hollow. The conditions of what happened over in Broadview were not the same. The speed at which it moved down was not anticipated. The winds were driving the embers totally sideways, and it caught a lot of people off guard. No one had that in their slide carousel of previous fire behavior. The fuel loading that we had in a ravine right below the homes brought a wall of flame that was up and over those homes that even if we had pre-positioned resources all along there, we wouldn't have had them in front of that wall of flame. We have to take into consideration the defensible space that's around the home, the condition of the home, egress out of there. Human lives are always more important than houses. At one point I had radio traffic from our dispatch center saying they're getting reports of a structure fire at such and such a location. And my response was, Rivercom, I'm looking at 8 homes burning right now. These houses that are on fire have a tremendous amount of fuel load on them. And it's carrying the sparks and embers down to the warehouse district. And then we get the report of fire starting up behind Save Mart. The embers spread to 3 different warehouse areas down there. Extraordinary actions were taken. We had them working for hours in 100+ degree temperature. There was a couple people that had IVs started, rehydrated that way, and put back out on the line. There was reports of embers the size of $50 and landing over a mile away. I've said to several people, but by the grace of God, we didn't have another fire start up in South Wenatchee or over in East Wenatchee. It was coming into number 1 Canyon. We were going to have an active firefight that next morning as soon as the sun came up. Instead, we had rain. We lost 30 structures, and I take that very personally. I also know that if it wasn't for the actions of the firefighters, the citizens of this community, the residents that were assisting, we would have potentially lost hundreds more.
Thanks for being here. I really appreciate the invitation to share some ideas with you. I'm Paul Hessburg, and this was actually my hometown of Wenatchee, Washington on June 29th, 2015. That was the day after the Sleepy Hollow fire. And as Chief Burnett said, we actually dodged the bullet in north central Washington. We weren't good, we were lucky. Rain put our fire out the morning of the second day. Over the next hour, I'm going to explain how we got into this era of megafires, and I'm going to talk about some concrete things that we can do about these big fires. If you leave with one idea, the idea I want you to leave with is that we have to learn to live with wildfire in a whole new way. Sleepy Hollow was a fairly small fire. You can see it west of Wenatchee there. It ended up burning just 3,000 acres because of that rain event. But in 2014 and 2015, our neighbors to the north, they experienced much larger and much more destructive fires. In gray there, you can see the 2014 fires. Several of these got bigger than 100,000 acres, and that's what we call a megafire. 2015 fires, you can see next to them in orange, and some of these were megafires as well. And for us in Washington State, 2014 and 2015 were back-to-back record-setting wildfire years in Washington. But it isn't just Eastern Washington, is it? Other areas of the West are experiencing this similar increased frequency in really large and really destructive fires. This, in fact, is a map of fires that are recorded just in the inland Northwest, and this is just the last 30 years. There's a lot of megafires on that map. In this next graph, I'm going to show you what it looks like for how much area is being burned each year. So the annual area burned. The blue line shows you what it would look like if there wasn't any year-to-year increase. Well, the upward trend of actual acres that are being burned year to year is pretty darn sobering, isn't it? It's actually increasing exponentially across the United States. The data on the structures that are being lost to wildfires is really sobering too. This next map just shows houses, warehouses, structures that are destroyed by fire from 1999 to 2016. So what you're looking at is the larger and the darker the dot gets, the more structures that are being lost in one fire. Some areas are losing upwards of 3,000 structures in an individual fire. These are people's homes, businesses, their garages, their cabins, their warehouses. Some people say, I'm really not affected by this issue. It's not that big of a deal. But I'd like to argue that as taxpayers, it should concern every one of us. In 2016, 57% of the entire national budget for the U.S. Forest Service went towards just fighting fires. That's up by 335% from just 17% of the budget 25 years ago. But that's not even the true cost of today's wildfires. Take a look.
When it comes to how much we're spending on wildfires, most people simply count the cost of fighting them. And it is true that over the last 3 decades, the amount we've spent on fire suppression has increased exponentially. In 2017, we spent a record-breaking $2.9 billion federal dollars on suppression. But while this is a lot of money, it's only part of the story. On average, this is what we spend on suppression, and this is what we spend rebuilding damaged or destroyed structures. Add to that the cost of restoring vital infrastructure, factor in the resulting loss of business revenue and lowering property values, and the true economic impact of a wildfire can exceed 100 times the amount spent on suppression. So what is the real total cost of wildfires in record-breaking 2017? $2.9 billion? No, closer to $300 billion. And who's paying for this? Around half of the bill is covered by federal dollars, and the other half is covered directly by homeowners, businesses, and nonprofits. In other words, you are paying for it.
1 year, $1/3 of $1 trillion. Megafires affect communities across our landscape each year, and they're impacting every single taxpayer. I've spent my career, the last 35 years, studying Western landscapes. What makes them tick? And the science is pretty clear. If we don't change some of our fire management habits, we're going to lose many more of our beloved landscapes. And some won't recover in our lifetime, or our kids' lifetime, or our grandkids' lifetime. And if you're like me, this Western landscape is why I live here. I love to work in it, play in it. My way of life depends on this landscape. I love it. As a father and as a scientist, I'm deeply concerned about what we're leaving behind for our kids. Bottom line is there's a lot at stake here. And it's time we all confront some tough truths about wildfire and come to understand that we need to learn to better live with wildfire in some new ways. And I'm going to unpack that here. We can change the way many of them come to our forests, our homes, and our cities. And that's really the point. I want to share with you some imagery of Western forests. Tell me what you think. They're pristine, right? They're beautiful. They're evocative of what we think a healthy forest should look like. In fact, I think this is what we all learned a healthy landscape looked like. But in fact, many of these forests are actually a ticking time bomb. They're ready to burn big and hot, and bigger and hotter than they used to. And what's more, these forests don't look anything like the forests we inherited 150 years ago. There's literally no comparison. But there are panoramic photos from the early 20th century that are taken from thousands of western mountaintops that give us a fair approximation of the landscapes that we did inherit. And the best word to describe these forests of old is they were really patchy. They weren't continuous blankets of trees. The historical landscape was this evolving, constantly evolving patchwork of open and closed canopy forests of all ages and sizes. And there was so much evidence of fire on that landscape. And the key is most of those fires were pretty small by today's standards. It's important to understand that across this landscape, a really good portion of it was open in meadows and in open canopied forests. And it was the meadows and the grassy understories of these open forests that actually spread many of the historical fires. There were other forces at work too, shaping the patchiness of these forests. For example, topography, whether a forest is on a north or a south slope, on a ridgetop or down in a valley bottom. The weather, how much snow and rain, sunlight and warmth a place gets, and elevation, how far up the hill a forest is. These things all work together to shape the way the forest grew. And the way the forest grew shaped the way fire behaved on the landscape. There was a crosstalk between the patterns of the forest and processes like fire. In dry forests, trees were open grown and pretty far apart, and fires occurred really frequently here. And as a consequence of that, when they occurred, they weren't that severe. In the moist and cold forests that were further up the hill, fires were less frequent, trees grew more densely, and it was ordinary for fires to be more severe here. So these different forest types, the fire severity, they co-created these powerful patchworks on the landscape. And these patchworks provided a natural resilience mechanism to resist fire's future spread across the landscape. Once a patch of forest burned, it would later prevent fires from spreading for a time. And a good way to think about it is that the burned patches on the landscape help the rest of the forest to be forest. So this patchwork is really critical. We now understand that fire on the landscape was the primary disturbance shaping all of our western landscapes. Everything that lives in the woods and on the range depends on building a life story with fire. Over thousands of years, native plants and animals have adapted to, and some are so adapted to fire, they actually require it to complete their life cycle. For example, ponderosa pine has this amazing thick bark. Jeffrey pine too, in your part of the word. And that thick bark protects the trees from the lapping flames of frequent fires all of the time, and it protects them for hundreds of years. But these trees actually need the mineral soil that's exposed by fire in order for the seeds to germinate. It's part of the process. Balsam root. We love it for its showy flower, but it has this amazing deep taproot, so it can be singed by fires year after year after year, and it bounces back. It stays there. Woodpeckers use burned snags to build their nests and raise their young. And after the woodpeckers move out, other birds and small mammals will use the cavities that the woodpeckers excavate to raise their young too. So there's life in dead burned forests. Landslides after fires bring boulders, trees, rocks, and soil, often violently down the hill slope. And then rivers sort these materials to build deep pools, riffles, glides, and spawning gravels. And we know these are essential fish habitats. Do you think of the native fish as being fire adapted? The fires are the process that create the aquatic habitats over space and time. Ceanothus, or buckbrush, resprouts after fires, and deer feed on the new shoots. And then the developing shrubs after fires protect burned hillsides from chronic erosion, and they leak nitrogen to other plants that are trying to establish after fires. Lodgepole pine cones, they open after fires. A tiny resin droplet seals each and every cone scale until a fire's heat melts that resin. The cones can open, the seeds can drop to the ground, and then seedlings birth forth. Fire makes that possible. For millennia, it was wildfires that maintained native plants and animals on a diverse and a really patchy landscape. Now let's add us humans to the mix. For 10,000 years, Native Americans lived on this landscape and they intentionally burned it, and they were master burners. They burned it a lot. They figured out that they could use fire to burn meadows and to thin certain forests so they could grow more food. And it also improved graze for the deer and the elk and the bison that they hunted. It kept those ungulates close rather than far away. They had literally hundreds of uses for fire. And sadly, as you know, in the 1850s, they were marshaled onto reservations, and much of that wisdom and that experience was temporarily lost. But there's huge efforts here in the US and in Canada to revitalize and recapture much of that experience and that wisdom. So how do we go from this diverse and patchy forest to one that's really dense and layered in just 150 years? Well, it starts with European settlement. And that began in earnest in the early to mid 1800s. This is us. This was my clan too. By the 1880s, livestock grazing, if you remember your history, was in full swing. The cattle and sheep, they're eating the grasses, which I just told you had been the conveyor belt for spreading many of the historical fires. So it was livestock grazing and the loss of Indian burning, which was the first dousing of fires in our region. And this prevented frequent fires from thinning out understory trees and burning up dead wood on the ground. Later came roads and railroads. And if you think about it, they're amazing fuel breaks, right? We didn't build them as fuel breaks, but that's how they worked. And they're further interrupting the flow of wildfire across that landscape. And then something happened that caused a really big pivot in our society. In 1910, we had a huge wildfire. It was bigger than the state of Connecticut. We called it the Big Burn. It stretched from eastern Washington to western Montana. It gobbled up over 3 million acres, several towns, and it killed 87 people in a matter of a few days. And because of this big burn, wildfire suddenly became public enemy number one, and it would shift how we would view fire for over 100 years. The Forest Service was 5 years old when this fire broke out, and they were suddenly tasked with putting out every fire they possibly could. And they took this responsibility seriously. They were provisioned for it. They were hired and funded to do it along with their partner agencies. And since that day, they've developed an incredible capacity to douse fires. In fact, they put out 95 to 98% of them every single year. Let's take a look at the results of those suppression efforts. This is a graph that shows, again, the annual acres burned going back to about 1920. By 1935, and what we call the 10 a.m. rule, have fires out by 10 a.m., fire suppression efforts had reduced acres burned annually really precipitously, and were able to hold fires at bay for about 50 years. So think 1935 to about 1985. And then at that point, a buildup in fuels and increasingly more frequent extreme fire weather starts to stymie more and more efforts to douse some of these fires. But what we didn't know at that time was that we had a ton of help by a cool and moist climate. That 50-year period when we were amazing at dousing fires, the climate was helping us out a lot, and it made our fire suppression efforts look amazing. And then you see acres burn go up again. There's never been more resources to douse fires. And so what I'm telling you is that from 1934 on, it wasn't wildfire that was sculpting our landscapes, it was now fire suppression that was the major effect on that landscape. In addition to firefighting, the Forest Service was managing timber harvesting and livestock grazing on federal lands, public lands. And by the 1940s and World War II, the timber industry was going pretty strong. And Congress was appropriating larger and larger sums of money each year to provide wood for a growing nation. And if you remember your history, we were going through huge, fast growing pains at that time. And logging removed the big and the old trees, more wood per stick, but these were the survivors of centuries of frequent fires. And what happened? Thin, small-barked, shade-loving trees filled in the gaps left by the old veterans. And our forests started to become dense, and they started to become layered, and trees were now beginning to touch each other. So we went from this open forest to a closed forest condition. We're still trying to grow trees that fast. So let's put it all together. Fires were intentionally blocked by roads and railroads. The cattle and sheep ate the grasses. Native American master burners were on reservations. The conveyor belt grasses for fires were gone. You add to that aggressive fire suppression, the harvest of large trees, the release of these small trees, and collectively these factors sort of conspired to create what I call the current epidemic of trees. Forests, right? Who knew? It's actually more trees than the landscape and the climate and the fire regime can accommodate, and that's the rub. So now when you compare forests of 100 years ago and today, you'll notice the change is pretty remarkable. Notice how that patchwork is filled in. These are from some of those lookouts I told you about. The dry south slopes are now covered with trees, so are the ridge tops. A patchwork that was once sculpted by small and medium-sized fires most of the time is actually filled in with trees. Do you get a feel for the blanket of trees and that change in the topography and the landscape? Let's go down on the ground now and take a look at some of these forests up close. We're standing in a dry mixed conifer forest. This particular area has received fire fairly frequently, and I want to show you, this is what a healthy dry mixed conifer forest looks like. If a fire comes through here, it's going to stay on the ground, burning through grasses, dried grasses, and twigs and branches and that sort of thing, and it's going to have difficulty getting up into the crowns. This is a very different looking mixed conifer stand. It hasn't seen fire in close to 100 years. One of the things you can see when you walk into a forest like this that's been without fire is the old bones, the old structure of the large trees that used to occupy the forest. And then you can see the thicket of small and medium-sized trees that have grown up in the absence of fire. Now, this is pretty clear and easy going, isn't it? Watch your eyes. Boy, this will go up hot when it goes. This is an example of the epidemic of trees that has occurred throughout the western United States, especially in mixed conifer forests. This patch of forest is really hurting. Fuels on the ground, fuel ladders, dead trees. So this is what we call a fuel ladder. A fuel ladder is trees of all sizes and ages that connect the fuels on the forest floor to the canopies of large trees. So as a fire is moving up this hill, it'll move into the lower branches of that fuel ladder, and the fire will torch out into those larger trees. And that's why it functions as a ladder. This ponderosa pine is in perfect shape after all the fires in its history, but this Douglas fir next to it's going to kill it. You know, everywhere you look in this patch of forest, you can see all the rules of a frequent fire regime are broken. Fire coming anywhere on this hillside is going to crown out and take out the big trees, and that's just not the way it used to work. The West has more trees than ever and is highly flammable, and people are moving into these woods in ever greater numbers. Seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? So folks are moving into these forests, and they're creating what we call an expanding wildland-urban interface, or sometimes we call it WUI for short. And homes in the WUI, they're tough to defend. And most firefighting dollars actually go to protecting homes and not forests. In a good year, it's just 50% of the total suppression bill. But in a bad year, it's more like 95% of the dollars are going towards protecting homes. And all too often, it's too little and it's too late. Where developments are large, the per home defense costs run in the tens of thousands of dollars. But where homes are isolated, the per home defense costs typically exceed the value of the houses. And you might figure firefighter and citizen safety is going to be job one, right? But it's us who continue to build our homes where they're most difficult to defend and where firefighters are put in harm's way. 2 recent studies, in fact, showed that about 70% of all new housing starts in the West are being built in this flammable and dangerous mess. But there's actually some really good news, too. Headwaters Economics has reported that more than 80% of the area that could become this wildland-urban interface is still undeveloped. And for communities like mine, that means that we still mostly have options to manage our wildfire issue. But the time to decide on where we're going to build, what materials we're going to build with, separating roads in and out of development so we can defend those neighborhoods, and then overall defensible neighborhood planning, that's well before the outbreak of wildfires. Once the wildfires are roaring, it's typically too late. Continued development in this wildland interface is putting serious pressure on firefighters too. And it's critical that we understand that we actually have a personal responsibility in all of this. Take a look.
Our county as a whole is a pretty big ag county. So the only place to go for development is on the hillside. And when you move further out in the wildland, there comes a point where that growth comes with a lot of risk. Roads are steeper, sage, shrub step type of fuels, or you get into the timber. Fires are different now. You could phrase it as a disaster waiting to happen. Folks think, I'm paying taxes for fire, so therefore those folks should protect me from fire, and that's just not the case. It's actually the homeowner's responsibility to make sure that they give us an opportunity to try to help save their house in the event of a fire. My first priority is to my firefighters and their families. I'll take a drive, go up and take a look at the steepness of the slope, look at the steepness of the roads, the fuel type that's around that subdevelopment. I also look at structures, so if there is a fire there, I got an idea of what we may be up against. Are there shrubbery or trees or any of that type of thing right up against the house? Limbs overhanging the house? Are they cleaning their gutters? Are they cleaning their roofs if they have pine trees, fir trees? What type of roofing do they have? How much decking do they have? What's the decking made out of? If they have a wood stove or a fireplace, where are they putting their wood? The rule of thumb is 30 feet around your structure, lean, mean, and green. We don't want you to lose your structure. We don't want you to lose all those belongings inside your structure. That's the last thing we want to do. They have to understand that it is a partnership and their responsibility is their piece of property.
So it's our job to make sure that they can protect our homes. That means we have homework to do to make it ready and keep it ready, right? It's clear we've got a lot of work to do in the interface around Wenatchee, right? But we're not alone. An awful lot of places in the West look just like we do, don't they? I want to shift gears now, and I want to introduce a compounding issue of some real importance. There's been a lot of recent press about the importance of an increasingly hotter, drier climate. Warmer winters, hotter, drier summers, more wind. Well, this more severe weather is having a huge effect on current megafires. And it's critical that we understand that these effects won't just continue, but they're actually going to continue to worsen. I want to use as an example a place far, far away because it's so incredible. Fort McMurray, Alberta. Do you remember the news? They experienced the largest wildfire in their history in May of 2016. Geographically, that's 1,000 miles north of north central Washington, Wenatchee, where I'm from, in boreal forests that are already halfway to the Arctic Circle in May. That fire, in a matter of a few days, destroyed 2,400 homes. It displaced 100,000 people. Many of them are not back in homes again. And it burned 1.5 million acres of boreal forest. Well, at the time, major news networks attributed this fire to warmer winter temperatures, earlier spring, hotter, drier summer, and they were dead right. To get a better understanding of how changes in our climate are mixing with wildfires and playing a critical role, we visited a colleague of mine. He's a climatologist at the University of Washington, Dave Peterson. Let's see what he has to say.
So of course we know that when we have hotter and drier weather, we're going to get more fire. So that's not rocket science. But what we're seeing is a potentially permanent change in our weather patterns to drier summers, longer fire seasons, and just having fire become a more prominent player across the landscape. When I sit down at my desk and I actually look at the data, it kind of hits me in the face. There are some things changing very quickly. We have about 100 years of fire history data in the western United States. And it's very easy to develop a statistical relationship between climate and fire occurrence. When we project those relationships into the future, by about mid-century, we end up getting 2 to 3 times more fire per year in eastern Washington and in other areas around the Intermountain West where dry forests exist. That's a tremendous change ecologically, and it's going to be a tremendous change also in terms of the impacts on human communities. So we're going to have a long adjustment as we go through this period of increased fire. And the main thing that we need to be aware of is a lot of our forests have not experienced fire for many decades. That means we have a lot of fuel buildup, and that means when fires do occur, they're going to be intense, they're going to be crown fires, and they'll probably cover a lot of area because it's very difficult to suppress those kinds of fire. At some point later in the 21st century, we may catch up with what I call the fire debt. But at least in the near term, we can probably expect to have a lot more of these high-intensity, large fires. We need a shift in attitude from the concept of resisting fire to living with fire, because it is part of our environment.
So the contribution of a hotter, drier, and now often windier climate is real. It's a really big deal. And even the most conservative forecasts for the future are fairly dire. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm from, fire seasons are now 40 to 80 days longer than they were just 50 years ago. In the worst years, that's a doubling of the length of our fire season, so that's a lot more exposure. In California, many years the fire season is year-long now. Didn't used to be that way. So these warmer temperatures and larger fires are a reality for the foreseeable future. We now know that area burned is driven by the climate. But even though these fires are going to be larger in the coming years, we don't need to live with the existing fuel conditions. That's a variable we have power over. And we have options and we have tools that we can apply. Fire severity, in fact, the energy coming out of a fire is driven by the fuels on the ground, interacting with winds, the steepness of the slope, and the density and the layering of trees. If we deal with these fuels in a manner that's consistent with a more natural fire regime, we can actually influence the severity of many of these fires. Bottom line, we can actually restore the former power of that patchwork. Let's put it all together. After just 150 years, the patchwork we once had is gone. We now have a dense carpet of forest. Because trees are growing closer together now, tree species, sizes, and ages are really similar over a fairly large area. Fires not only pass easily from tree to tree and acre to acre, but so too now do insect and disease outbreaks. and they're killing and reducing the vitality of pretty large areas of forest. And they're adding future dead wood to the forest floor. Fuel. After a century without fire, the buildup of fuels in many forests is at powder keg levels. So we have more extreme fire weather, forests have changed, fire seasons are getting longer, and the acres that have burned since 2000 until today will at least double or triple in the next 3 decades. That's a frightening scenario, and we're building houses in the middle of it. That's the best part. So when we do get a fire, large areas like we see today, they can literally go up in smoke. Forest burning at these large scales can be a real problem for forests too. Some of these areas get stuck in a rut. You see, historical forest fires left islands of trees to basically reseed a new forest. And current fires are either killing these islands of trees because they're severe, or firefighters are taught to burn them out to avoid fire spotting. So these large areas can become perpetual meadows or shrub fields that will carry fire again and again and again, and this can delay the return of new forests for decades to centuries at a time. So now I want to take another look at the forests I showed you in the beginning. Do they look any different to you now? These conditions scare the daylights out of me, and that's one of the reasons why I'm traveling and actually giving this talk. I think there's a lot to be done. It's not just scary. There's a message of hope, and it's very, very large. We have the tools to restore the power of that patchwork, the natural resilience mechanism of those landscapes. And we have some know-how to do it. In fact, there are a lot of people who are working on this problem, and they've come up with a solid strategy. It's that crazy long name right there. This strategy has been worked through by all the government, federal agencies, the tribes, state governments, and so forth. And it has 3 critical legs to it. One of them is that we need to create resilient landscapes around our communities. We need to change the way fire can come to our communities. We need to create and maintain fire-adapted communities. That means we get our houses and our businesses ready for fire before it comes, because it's coming and we know it. And then we continue to maintain this safe and effective wildfire response. I want to take a moment, break these 3 legs down so we can get a better understanding that we actually all have individual roles and responsibilities in this. Someone's not going to do it to us. The first leg of the stool is to create wildfire resilient landscapes. So we're working to change the way wildfires arrive at our homes, our businesses, and our communities. We can recreate landscapes that can tolerate fires much better, that are more typical for those forest types and those rangeland conditions, where the patchwork is restored and the landscape can much better able self-regulate fire growth, fire rate of spread, and fire severity. And to get there, we're going to need a lot of tools in the belt. Let's look at a handful of them. One clear choice involves the use of prescribed burning, and it's an extremely helpful tool. We used to do about 10 times more of it, and we don't now because we're pretty scared of smoke.
Prescribed fire is an extremely important tool for managing fire-dependent ecosystems. So after a couple years, I discovered the prescribed fire councils in the southeastern United States, where they've been very, very successful in implementing prescribed burning. And we imported that idea here to North Central Washington, established the North Central Washington Prescribed Fire Council. In regions where the communities have embraced prescribed fire, we have seen reduced fire behavior, more healthy fire-dependent wildlife habitat, and more easily controlled wildfires when wildfires do occur. What we do when we prescribe burn is we do a fuels analysis and write a burn plan, put in fire lines or hose, sprinklers, We have to get a permit to burn and also get smoke approval on the day of the burn. The prescribed fire is burning up a lot of the fine fuels and fuels that have accumulated on the forest floor over the last 100 years or so when the last fire occurred. We conducted a prescribed burn in the spring of 2014, and we'd done some thinning in there too. And in the August of 2015, fire came into the area that we had prescribed burn. I knew that it would definitely have an effect on fire behavior, but I was quite taken aback by how the wildfire stopped right on the fire line that was used during the controlled burn. The fire in other areas crossed into the area that had been previously prescribed burn, but the fire behavior was very subdued. We do need to bring prescribed fire back into the toolbox. In order to do that, we're going to need public support from people that understand that fire is an integral part of habitat management. No fire is not an option, but if we have more prescribed fire, we're going to have less severe and more controllable wildfire.
In Washington State, where I come from, we are doing prescribed burning, but at nowhere near the scale of a need. What do I mean by that? Currently, wildfires are burning about 7 times as many acres as we're treating with prescribed burning, and that's the very thing we need to flip around. And I imagine your numbers are pretty similar here. In eastern Washington, about half of the landscape would benefit from treatments that either change the patterns of forest or the fuel conditions that are influential to wildfire behavior. That's a big job, but we have some issues. High cost, lack of investment in the problem, poor access, and unrealistic smoke management goals. We accept wildfire smoke, but we hate prescribed burning smoke. There's a lack of social license to burn fairly large areas and apply these tools. Prescribed burning outside of forest in the rangelands is a big deal too. Currently, about 2/3 of the acres that burn in megafires actually are burning in rangelands, not in forests. In most years, we could graze or burn the flashy fuels around our communities and protect them. We could protect high-value wildlife assets and recreation assets before the onset of the wildfire season. Most of the time, we just simply don't get around to it. We don't do it. But we have that opportunity. Imagine if we had a burning and a grazing plan that strategically distributed these grazed and burn areas before the heat of the fire season. Firefighters would use these as containers to steer new ignitions into to keep fires small from the start. And this is the kind of thing that we need to give firefighters to up the octane in our fire suppression. Places to anchor and control ignitions when we get them before the onset of fire. These treated areas before the fire are incredibly important to the job. The greatest barrier to prescribed burning is the smoke it produces. We don't like it. We don't want it. But the smoke from prescribed burning each year and each decade is much less than that from wildfires. It's 50 to 90% less smoke, and the smoke you save is the smoke that hurts people, the small little particulates. That comes out of the smoldering combustion of a wildfire. It's a minuscule fraction of prescribed burning smoke. This is a John Marshall repeat photo. On the top, you can see smoke from a prescribed burn. That lasted for a day and a half. It's 1/10 of the smoke in the bottom. This is in the Wenatchee, my home valley. In the bottom, you can see smoke from a wildfire. That was the 2012 Wenatchee complex. That fire burned for over 30 days. The smoke was 10 times more, and we lived in masks for a month. The problem is that wildfire smoke gets a pass. It's not regulated. It's act of God stuff. It's considered unavoidable. But that's nonsense. To a large degree, it can be reduced. We co-created these conditions. Prescribed burning smoke, on the other hand, is regulated. It's regulated because it's treated as an avoidable nuisance because the smoke from it is considered nuisance smoke. And it's because we strike the match. But if you think about it, smoke is smoke, right? And you'd think the best human health alternative and the best forest management alternative would be the one that gives you the best fire behavior and the least smoke to hurt people. Well, that's not the way it is right now. Most days, managers here in this area who are ready to do the prescribed burning, they're not able to do it under current smoke management conditions. They're set to go, and on average, they get to burn 20% to 25% of the acres that they actually have prepared to burn. This is the kind of thing we have to work together to get changed. Hopefully it's clear by now that Smokey can't say it in one sentence anymore, huh? Another tool in the box for creating these resilient landscapes is mechanical thinning. Where does it fit into all of this? Well, let's face it, 20th century logging soured many of us and made us gun shy of any kind of timber harvesting whatsoever. But I'd like to argue that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We changed those methods really significantly because they needed to be changed. We are running out of forest, we are running out of old growth. But harvest methods as a consequence of those changes have really changed. Meal utilization is great. We can use really small material now, and the problem is in the little trees. And if fires aren't thinning those forests and burning up dead wood, fuels and trees continue to increase, and that's the current predicament. So I'd like to suggest that a better question today is, can we now harvest these small trees in a way that's good for the health and the resilience of the forest, and it's profitable for the person doing the work? We think we can. Let's take a look.
I've come to believe we do need some active management out there on the landscape. If the forest is homogeneous, the fires do have an easier time burning more severely in those cases. We do need the timber industry to make our forests more resilient.
If there are lots of trees on the landscape, we can go in and thin those trees to an appropriate spacing where the forest can handle regular intervals of fire and can handle insect and disease coming through, and it can be resilient to all those things. So when fire does come through, it behaves like it did here. It behaved in a way that was safe for the firefighters. They could manage this fire, and it's actually beneficial for the landscape. When we leave here, the forest that's left is higher value than when we found it. And then we can take those byproducts to the marketplace, and we're able to carve out a nice business in a rural community. We did some treatment, and that created small logs, which we put on a truck and shipped to the mill. Once we get it to the mill, we turn them into 2x4s. The byproduct of that activity is chips, sawdust, shavings, and bark. Those products all have a destination, whether that be chipwood to go to the pulp and paper plant or biomass to go to the power facilities. All kinds of wood products that you don't think about every day, but they come from these small diameter trees that come from treatments like here at this forest. I think some of our biggest allies now are environmentalists.
We used to protest against old-growth logging. I've come around to believing that we do need the timber industry and the infrastructure. And there's evidence that thinning followed by prescribed fire, which can be controlled, definitely results in less severe fires. When I talk to people who are very concerned about any tree cutting in the national forest, they've seen the big clear cuts of the past, they've been convinced that logging is bad, and I emphasize we're not thinning every acre of the forest. We're going to focus on the areas that might burn the hottest. We're going to focus on the areas closer to communities. The right thing to do out in our public forests is to apply science, utilize a timber industry that can take small diameter trees, take strict conservation measures, and get to work on a landscape level of restoring our forests.
Why can't we mechanically thin an entire forest? Well, in a lot of areas it's not needed and it's not appropriate. So you'll hear simple solutions like that, and they're oversimplified and they're nonsensical. That's the case in north central Washington where I live. We got 4 million acres of forest land, and 3 million of it is in national parks and wilderness areas, and that tool isn't appropriate there. It's not consistent with the enabling legislation, and we have other tools we can apply there. But where it is appropriate in managed forests, we have some big issues. Adequate commercial volume, road access. There's a lack of sawmills. In Oregon and Washington, we've lost probably 3/4 of our mills. They've closed down since the early 90s, and it's difficult to site a new small wood mill without the promise of a stable supply, even of these smallest logs, which are the problem. I'd like to argue that what is needed is new social license to do the right kind of work, to do it in the right places, apply the right tool to the situation, rebuild some of that needed mill infrastructure so you can actually get the restorative work done. I think it's a key part of the puzzle. Third really great tool is called managed wildfire. It's a great tool and we're afraid of it, but it's an amazing tool. Sometimes fire managers can herd a naturally ignited wildfire across the landscape, and they can use these fires to thin forests and consume fuels when the weather and the fuel conditions permit. But in order to work well, there can't be too much fuel and the forest can't be too dense or layered. Otherwise, you get erratic fire behavior or it's completely unpredictable. As communities, we're afraid to use managed wildfires because we worry that one or two will get away. And one or two will get away. The weather can turn unpredictably, but when you compare that scenario with the current wildfires that we're experiencing and the increases that are forecasted, far fewer acres, far fewer homes will be lost when you apply managed wildfires, even with a few escapes. That's the key comparison, and the choice is clear, and we have to figure out how to move in that direction. Today, wildfires are treating more acres than any other tool on the landscape in every state in the Union. A great example of a managed wildfire was the 2016 Buck Creek wildfire. This is on my home forest, the Okanagan and the Wenatchee. Lightning ignited this fire. Firefighters had a few good days to herd it away from private lands onto public forests. This map shows the progression of the fire. Hot colors severe, cool colors less so. Now, the next time a fire moves into this area, it's going to burn less severely because fuels have been reduced by this managed wildfire. Trees have been thinned out, and it won't support the same kind of fire behavior because on a moderate fire weather day, we let a wildfire do work. We can couple it with prescribed burning beforehand to actually set it up even better, developing anchor points and what we call control points on the landscape. This is what fire suppression teams really want to be able to have so they can bust all sorts of moves that they currently can't bust on that landscape. And that will improve our batting average over what it is currently at the time of a wildfire. The problem with the current landscape is that the scale of the need is really large and the time is short. I'll use Oregon and Washington as an illustration. In Oregon and Washington, 12 million acres in this red area need some sort of intentional treatment to restore forest age conditions that support better fire behavior or to knock the fuels down to support better fire behavior. That's 40 to 50% of that red area. So the need's large. Having a lot of tools will be important, and getting started and getting to scale will be important as well. It's likely that we don't have 20 years' work to get the needed work done. Climate predictions are showing that the burned area is since 2000 is going to double or triple by mid-century. That's in the next 3 decades. As I mentioned before, we're currently putting out 95 to 98% of all fire starts. Well, many of these we can actually put back to work. In my lab, we study the fire weather each season, and more than 50% of the burn days are moderate fire weather days where fires could actually be doing work for us. Think of that thinning and prescribed burning is applied to the places where you need high certainty about control on the perimeter and control on the fire behavior, that sort of thing. The second leg of the cohesive strategy is to build wildfire resilient communities. Homeowners, neighborhoods, municipalities need to get prepared for the coming fires. They're coming. That means we start fireproofing our homes, our yards, and our businesses, and we change our level of preparedness in the WUI. It's our WUI. It's our urban interface. We need to focus on where we're building and the building materials that we're building with. Adopting the National Wildland-Urban Interface Code is a great thing for new developments, and we need to ask for it in our existing developments. That means we have to work with our county commissions and say, we want to get better prepared in our interface. As communities, we need to get better educated about the risks that we have in front of us. We need to take a hard look at our homes and our neighborhoods and make some badly needed changes to roofing materials, our decks, what we landscape with. Every one of these things has an impact on how our house and our yard is going to respond to a wildfire. If we take care of these details ahead of time, firefighters are going to be able to protect our valuable homes, our businesses. And the key is going to be to work together in homeowner associations, in neighborhood groups, conservation districts, state forestry departments, NRCS offices. They're all coordinating lots of efforts across the western U.S. Some are even providing chipping and biomass disposal for residents who are willing to either thin out their trees and shrubs or contract for people to do that. Makes a big difference. There's a lot of resources out there. If you haven't checked out firewise.org, please do it. A lot of intel for you there. Let's go and meet some friends of mine, Mike and Sarah Rolfs. They're taking care of their 80-acre patch of forest in advance of the coming fires.
We've lived at our property for about 12 years now, and it was not maintained. The last natural forest fire that's been through there was from 1918, I think I had a forester tell us. So nothing has been done other than some harvesting of trees for firewood. With the density and the disease and the spindliness and the unhealthiness of the forest, it is just ready to create an inferno. One little spark out there and the whole thing would go up and we'd lose everything that we love about being out there. So we really felt at risk. And then it also becomes a matter of responsibility and being a good steward of the land, not just for our own safety and our neighbor's safety, but for the wildlife and the habitat in general. It's really not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a fire's gonna come through. So while Mike and I have been chipping away at trying to mitigate the unhealthy forest over the last 12 years, we've decided that we really want to just take care of it. And so we contacted a forester who developed a forest management plan for us. And in the forest management plan, it prescribes any sort of danger areas that need treatment per se, or things that can be areas that can be left alone. And from that, we became aware of some cost share grants via Cascadia Conservation District, the DNR, and NRCS. And then we've hired a commercial crew to come out there and take care of it. We kind of took a look around our property and realized that while we have a pretty good defensible space, the house itself really wasn't that fire safe. And so we decided that we needed to do something about that. And so we had a Firewise type assessor to do a home assessment for us.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Annie. So I'll just sort of do a 360 around the house, and I'm gonna look at the house starting at the foundation and moving to the top of the roof. And
Annie was able to point out some really specific things that were really easy and tangible to do, not very expensive, and were able to complete pretty quickly.
oh, see, these are the vents that I'm talking about, those soffit vents. We want those to be in good repair. We want to make sure there's not exposed roofing material.
I can tell you when I walk out there, I just have this sense of relief. Not only is it beautiful, and I wish I'd done this like 12 years ago when we first got the property, but the risk is just, I guess I didn't realize that I was living with this heightened state of fear of what was going to happen. I feel so much safer and responsible for taking care of the land that we decided to purchase.
The final leg of the cohesive strategy is to maintain a safe and effective wildfire response. As you probably suspect, we have the best supplied and the best trained suppression workforce in the entire world here in the US. The trouble is, no matter how well we fight fires, some are uncontrollable. They burn under hot, dry, windy conditions, and we can't put firefighters in front of them. And it's the uncontrollable 2 to 5% that are causing all the damage and all the cost to contain. The simple fact is that fire suppression alone, it's an incomplete answer. And what's needed is a cultural shift by us from being reactive about fire to becoming primarily proactive about fire. When we make our landscapes and our communities fire resilient ahead of time, we give firefighters the best chance they'll ever have of protecting our homes, our neighborhoods, our livelihoods. As you've probably gathered, this is a social problem. It's got an ecological explanation. It took me most of my career to realize I was studying the ecology of fires, but I was studying a social problem. It's going to take all of us to solve it. It's not just up to land managers and firefighters to solve this. Public support for using these tools is poor. And in fact, we're part of the problem. We want fires to just go away, don't we? And take that smoke with it. But there isn't a future ahead of us without a lot of fire and smoke in it. The option's not on the table. And we're co-owners of the public lands. These are the people's lands. And it's our job to either take initiative and create new expectations for those lands or to expect continued large losses. We can and should spread a message like this to lawmakers at all levels. These are folks whose job it is to change the way we manage our fires and our forests. We can take responsibility for our property, our neighborhoods, our towns, our wildland interface, our building codes. Simple solutions are going to be offered. Thin everything, prescribe burn everything, use managed wildfires everywhere. But these are radical oversimplifications. It's not that easy. It's a harder problem. We need lots of tools, and in fact, we need your good minds to determine both ecologically and socially appropriate mixes of tools according to the landscape that's in front of you. I want to leave you with a couple of questions to ponder, because for me, they're the nut of it. How do you want your fire? Do you want it measured or wild and unpredictable? How do you want your smoke? Do you want it meted in small or belching in large, ongoing, unbridled doses? How do you want your forests? They're ours. Do you want them green and growing? Or do you want them black and gone? How fire safe do you want your communities to be? Here today and tomorrow? We don't need to be surprised when the fires come. They're coming. Are your local forests and towns ready for them? We don't need to grieve over burned homes. We can get prepared. Are you? It's up to us. It's really up to us. There are resources, and in fact, I think we have the tools to get this job done. Shall we begin? Thank you very much for your kind attention.